Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the invitation. I will speak about the ancient roots of the Christian-Jewish relationship in the Holy Land. Tacitus, one of the greatest historians of Rome ever, published his Annals in 117. He mentions Christianity in the context of an event which happened more than 50 years earlier, the burning of Rome in 64 AD. It reads as follows: Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and the most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. I think it is clear from the above that Tacitus, a blue-blooded Roman aristocrat, had no sympathy either for Christians or Jews, and that is putting it mildly. However, it is also clear that he had a fairly accurate knowledge of the birth of Christianity. This new religious movement, founded by Christ, was born in Judea, in the province that came under direct Roman rule in 6 AD. Since it was originally a Jewish sect, first Christians were predominantly Jewish in origin, as evidenced by the famous graffito discovered in Pedagogium in Rome. The deity crucified on a cross with the head of an ass, to whom Alexamenos prays, is, of course, the Jewish Jesus. According to a very old anti-Semitic prejudice, dating back to the Hellenistic era, Jews worship a donkey-headed deity in their temple. We are informed by Tertullian that Romans spread the same propaganda about Christians. I'm sorry. I forgot to change my glasses. Okay. Notwithstanding, the relationship between Christianity and Judaism is fraught with contradictions, both in Judea and in the diaspora. Although Rabban Gamaliel asked the Sanhedrin for tolerance toward Christians, this doesn't seem to have been applied for long. According to the Acts of Apostles, Stephanos, or Saint Stephen, was a deacon in the early church at Jerusalem who angered members of various synagogues by his teachings. Accused of blasphemy at his trial, he made a speech denouncing the Jewish authorities who were sitting in judgment on him and was then stoned to death. Saul of Tarsus, later known as Paul the Apostle, a Pharisee and Roman citizen, participated in Stephen's execution in circa 34 AD. Almost 3 decades later, James the Just, brother of Jesus Christ, who was the leader of the church in Jerusalem, was also stoned to death by the Pharisees in order of the high priest Ananus ben Ananus in AD 62. This even shocked contemporary Jewry so much that even Flavius Josephus, the former rebel leader and later official historian of the Flavian house, remembered in his work Antiquitatis of the Jews this terrible murder, and modern scholarship has almost universally acknowledged the authenticity of this reference. Judea was under Roman occupation during the formative period of Christianity. Since Jesus was not accepted as savior by the religious establishment and the majority of the Jews in Judea, it was believed that the fulfillment of the messianic prophecies was still to come. This was the case for the Pharisees, Essenes, and especially the Zealots, but not for the Sadducees, who probably got along well with the Romans. Jesus had predicted the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. "Look, your house is left to you desolate," which must have been a clear message to his followers. During the First Jewish War, the Romans did indeed destroy the temple and the whole Jerusalem in 70 AD, which has had consequences for Judaism as a religious system to this day. Although the Jews were not yet banned from the capital, the whole country was confiscated as public land, ager publicus, and sold off. Jews, regardless of sex, age, or status, were taxed 2 drachmas a year, which they had to pay into a special treasury called Fiscus Judaicus. According to church tradition, which we read about in detail in Eusebius, the Christians didn't take part in this war, but fled to Pella, a city in the Decapolis, in obedience to Jesus' prophecy. I quote, "When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city." End of quote. We know of 2 more successive wars fought by the Jews against the Romans. The Diaspora War, or War of Quietus, lasted between 115 to 117, but we do not know whether Christians were involved. However, Christians were not allowed to take part in the last great war, the Bar Kokhba uprising, between 132 and 136 AD. Even though Arabs and Samaritans were fighting for the liberation of Jerusalem, according to the Christian tradition, Bar Kokhba's troops persecuted Christians living in Judea. The oppression of the revolt had even more serious consequences. Hundreds of thousands of Jews died or were deported to far corners of the imperium, and the country was almost completely destroyed. Jerusalem and Judea were also stripped of their name. The former was renamed Aelia Capitolina, the latter Syria Palestina. Jews were banned from Jerusalem under penalty of death. The surviving Jewish population moved to the north, where religious life gradually resumed. The Patriarchate, which emerged around the turn of the 3rd century under the leadership of Rabbi Judah I, had the support of the Severan dynasty. The testimony of Origen, who lived in Caesarea, views the function of the Jewish patriarch as that of a king, enjoying, among many other privileges, the power of capital punishment. The Tannaim, or teachers or repeaters, were the rabbinic sages whose views are recorded in the Mishnah from approximately 10 to 220 AD. Several rabbinic academies were established. The first at Yavne, which was the place of decisive debates about the canonicity of certain biblical books. It was Yavne that inspired and sanctioned the new Greek language version of the Bible, the Aquila of Sinope. The events that preceded and followed by the Bar Kokhba uprising resulted in the decay and death of the school at Yavne. The Sanhedrin was removed from Yavne to Usha, and from here finally arrived at Tiberias. This process indicates the ultimate spiritual supremacy of Galilee over Judea, the latter having become depopulated by the War of Hadrian. Meanwhile, Christian intellectuals used the dispersion of the Jews and the ban on their living in Jerusalem and Judea as evidence of the collective guilt of God's original chosen people, and even as direct evidence for proving that Jesus is the Messiah. Although Justin Martyr was born around 90 or 100 AD into a Greek family at Flavia Neapolis, today Nablus, near the ancient biblical city of Shechem, he knew little or no Hebrew and Aramaic and had only a passing acquaintance with Judaism. For Justin Martyr, the historical proof of the truth and fulfillment of the prophecy is the Churban of 70. I quote, that the land of the Jews then was to be laid waste. Here, what was said by the spirit of prophecy, and he here quotes Isaiah chapter 64, and you are convinced that Jerusalem has been laid waste, as was predicted, and concerning its desolation, and that no one should be permitted to inhabit in, and the death is decreed against the Jew apprehended entering it, you know very well. Justin's dialogue with Trypho is unique in that he provides information on tensions between Jews and Gentile believers in Jesus of the 2nd century. He speaks of the Jews who have anathematized and do anathematize this very Christ in the synagogues. Justin is certainly referring to the Amida prayer, also called the Shemone Esrei, or 19, point 12 of which was the curse pronounced on the heretics, Birkat Haminim, asking God to destroy those in heretical sects who slander Jews. The version of the Jerusalem Talmud found in the Cairo Geniza proved that this curse was originally directed against the Christians. I quote, "May the Nazarenes, Hanotzrim, and the sectarians, Minim, perish as in a moment." End of quote. The early Palestinian rabbinic attitude is also expressed on Tosefta Hulin and paralleled in Babylonian Talmud Avodah Zarah, which forbid Jews to have contact with followers of Jesus. I skip here. After the oppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the demographic composition of Judea-Palestina has also changed. By circa 120 AD, 2 complete legions were already stationed in the country, one in Jerusalem, other on the border of Galilee and Samaria, and several auxiliary troops were deployed. A good proportion of the soldiers who discharged from these units, military diplomas prove it, settled in the country. Archaeological evidence indicates a mix of Roman veterans and migrants from western parts of the empire who settled in Aelia Capitolina, its surroundings, administrative centers, and along the main roads, as well as immigrants from the coastal plain and neighboring provinces such as Arabia, Syria, and Phoenicia, who settled in the countryside. New pagan colonies were founded in Judea at Eleuteropolis, which is Beit Jibrin, Diospolis, which is Lydda, and Nicopolis, which is Emmaus. By 300 AD, Jews formed only a quarter of the population and lived in compact settlements in Galilee. By the 5th century, Christianity had gained further ground among the population and Christians formed a majority in Palestine. This demographic change, of course, has had major religious and cultural consequences. Pagans brought their own culture, temples, altars, statues, as well as entertainment centers, 13 theaters, 9 circuses, and 4 amphitheaters, and numerous public baths were built across the country. At the same time, Christianity with a pagan background also became stronger since great many soldiers already professed the new faith. It is no coincidence that the oldest known Christian church in the world was found in Megiddo, in the area of the 2nd Legionary Camp at Kefar Otnai, which is Legio. In 2005, the Israeli archaeologist Yotam Teper of the Tel Aviv University discovered the remains of the so-called Megiddo church, dated to circa 230 AD, a time when Christians were still persecuted in the Roman Empire. On one of the Greek dedicatory inscriptions of the 54 square meter large mosaic mentions a Roman centurion, Gaianus, who donated his own money to have the mosaic made. The massive Christianization of the Holy Land begins with the activities of Constantine the Great and his mother Helena between 326 and 328. According to Eusebius, who records the details of her pilgrimage to Palestine and other eastern provinces, she was responsible for the construction of beautification of the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem and the Church of Eleona on the Mount of Olives, sites of Christ's birth and ascension, respectively. In Jerusalem, she destroyed the Temple of Venus, which Hadrian had deliberately built over Golgotha, and ordered the building of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In parallel with the process of Christianization, the building of new synagogues and the renovation of old ones were forbidden by law from the 4th century onwards. Nevertheless, the laws could hardly be effective. In Capernaum, for instance, which has been referred as a Christian holy place in the rabbinic sources and by the 4th century was predominantly inhabited by Christians, a relatively large Jewish synagogue was built in the early 5th century. Archaeologist Jody Magnus has suggested on the basis of numismatic and ceramic evidence that virtually all Galilean synagogues should be dated to the 5th century. In addition, the Capernaum synagogue rises almost directly next to the early Byzantine basilica, which, according to Christian tradition and archaeological finds, was built over the house of the Apostle Peter. However, at the end of the 4th century and in the first half of the 5th century, the relationship between Jews and Christians was not always peaceful. Between the end of the 4th until the end of the 6th century, several attacks are being reported against Jewish synagogues across the Roman Empire, from Tipasa, Numidia, to Kalinikon, Mesopotamia. In Palestine, one of the most notorious examples is the rampage instigated by the Syrian monk Bar Sauma, later bishop of Nisibis, who, together with his supporters, attacked and destroyed several synagogues in the early 5th century. In 438, Bar Sauma and 40 of his followers attacked Jews praying at the ruins of the temple in Jerusalem, killing many. Tense relations between some local Christian and Jewish communities are reflected in the recurring imperial edicts that forbade attacks against Christians and the destruction of their synagogues in the Codex Theodosianus. Needless to say, these laws have been equally ineffective. In earlier scholarship, the development of Christianity in the 1st centuries AD had often been seen in the light of the so-called parting of the ways model. In reality, there were blurred boundaries between Jewish and Christian communities is also expressed in the decisions of many ecclesiastical councils that tried to prohibit the interaction of Christians, even clergy, with their neighboring Jewish communities. For instance, mixed marriages and sexual relations between Christians and Jews were prohibited already in the Synod of Elvira in 306. But the appearance of this theme in later imperial legislation shows that the persistence of these relationships despite increasing public pressure against them. Tanaitic sources also prohibit social and sexual intercourse with minim, forbid their food and drink, and label their children as mamzerim, or illegitimate. These sources also forbid doing business and conversing with minim, as well as teaching their children a trade. These decrees on both sides show just how unsuccessful the separation of Jews and Christians was in real life. Not only did Christians occasionally visit synagogues, but even rabbis could flirt with Christian doctrine. The most famous and often cited example is the story of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanos' arrest and later release. He was suspected of heresy, which in this case most probably meant contacts with some sort of Christians at Sepphoris. There have emerged two quite opposite ways to envision Jewish-Christian relations in the Holy Land. Mordechai Aviam emphasizes the strict boundaries between Jewish and Christian areas of settlements and interprets the available evidence in light of Jewish-Christian conflict or Jewish-Christian antagonism. Recent scholarship dealing with Jewish and Christian relations in the ancient world suggests, however, that these relations were not only characterized by conflict and mutual hostility. This recent scholarly trend lends support to Eric Meyer's last sentence, who sees, this recent scholarly trend lends support to Eric Meyers, who sees Jewish and Christian communities as living side by side with each other, and remarks that we would be making a great mistake if we were to think of Jews and Christians only as enemies. Thank you very much.